Hello, Americans. I'm Kenton McNall. It's Constitution time. Today is Friday, December 4th, 2020. Our election dramas continue as all eyes have turned to Georgia, where two important Senate races will be decided a month from tomorrow. Everybody's headed that way, from the president to the former president and everyone in between. But tonight, I want to talk about a little bit different subject. I want to talk about the media and its role, what I see as its role, in the division of Americans. Our Constitution was created to bring us together as a single nation. And we've talked many times about the brilliance and the foresight of our forefathers that created the Constitution, and at least the first 10 amendments. One of the guarantees of the Constitution is the freedom of the press, or a free press. And historically, that's been one of the most important of the guarantees of the Constitution, and one that has served our country very, very well. I believe that the creators of the Constitution were very foresighted men, and not incapable of knowing how the press would expand. Surely in their lifetimes it had expanded. It was a very important part of the processes that led to the American Revolution. And some of the problems that we have with the media today were well known to them at that time. Certainly, they had opinion pages, they had editorial pages in their newspapers, and certainly the news that they read in those papers were not free of bias. The professional norms that became very prevalent in the United States, especially with the advent of television news, did not exist at that time. So it would not have been unusual for people to get very up in arms about something that appeared in their newspaper. The Silence Do-Good letters that were written by Benjamin Franklin surely set many people off, as did many of the articles that surrounded the release of the Federalist Papers, no doubt. But it is hard to imagine that our founders could have possibly foreseen the extent and the reach and the influence of today's media that goes far beyond spectator sport for readers, consumers, and reaches directly into our homes and directly into our minds in some ways to influence us and even to manipulate us. And I think that is one of the most significant aspects of today's media. Now, we all know, as children of the television age, which has been built by advertisers, or at least we should all know, that what we hear and see on television absolutely and very directly influences us. When we see an ad for a thing, we become more likely to buy that thing. And thus is the empire of television been built by the billions of dollars poured into it by advertisers. And that continues in media in all of its forms. How did Facebook get so powerful? The exact same vehicle, advertising. But some of the norms that regulate television, or at least have in the past, have not extended into things like social media. Media now has so many forms and formats, so many different ways that messages and quote-unquote news can be delivered to us that it's very, very hard to keep track of. I'll focus for this conversation on television media, and probably most specifically the cable news media. I have a lot of problems, personally, with cable news media. I think that it is getting into very, very dangerous territory. And if the founders of the Constitution knew that a free press was important to the success of our country, how would they feel about today's media? And will that freedom continue to extend to the media if the media literally becomes weaponized in such a way that it deliberately divides us, incites us, turns us against each other as countrymen. I see signs that that could happen or is happening, don't you? Very divisive things are said by many people, by our politicians, over the last 4 years by our president and many others in government. Very influential people who don't need a lot of help to be influential. But when the media amplifies and becomes a megaphone for every negative, divisive thing that is said, when tweets that were bad enough the first time they were sent out are repeated endlessly by media supposedly from both sides of the political spectrum, since media is certainly very, very biased, is that not exactly what's happening? Aren't they becoming the megaphone for those negative thoughts and communications that should never have been said in the first place, but now have been repeated thousands of times? So what if the media literally begins to become something that is eating away at the foundations of our nation? Will we still consider it constitutional, something that was intended by the framers of the Constitution? It'd be interesting to know what they would say if they could observe. But I have a lot of specific difficulties with the media that I'll just trot out here. One certainly is that just as our framers read newspaper that may have been written by professional standards of the time, those standards were not what they became in the United States for journalistic integrity and excellence. Edward R. Murrow and CBS News set standards for television news that survived for many, many decades and served us well because the opinion page was kept separate from the news page unless someone was deliberately there to deliver an editorial. And the same was true for print. And those standards really began to erode. I couldn't tell you when or exactly why. Personally, Geraldo Rivera sticks in my mind as somebody who brought some of that about. But all joking aside, those standards began to erode. And today, there is no difference between quote-unquote news delivery and absolute editorializing. In fact, the only way the cable news networks have been able to fill 12 or 24 hours a day with news is by constant editorializing, taking the few scraps of legitimate news and doing their best to stretch it into 24 hours, but filling the space in between with opinions. Reporters and anchor people from each network interviewing each other constantly. A panel of 4 people is likely to have 3 reporters from the network and one person who might be able to provide some facts that are heavily spiced with opinion. And that means that we're basically being fed people's either individual thoughts or, worse, what the corporate network wants to be heard on their airwaves. There's a particular show that I like to watch every week. Journalist named Fareed Zakaria. His show is on CNN on Sunday mornings. I like his view. I'm sure he's no less liberal than anyone else on CNN, but he seems to have a more worldview. But right after his show is a show that's hosted by a man named Brian Stelter. And it's called Reliable Sources. And I like that show a little bit less. It's a show about the media. And you would think that's interesting to this topic, but it ends up being a showcase for everything that I think might be wrong with the media. And this last weekend, they literally were practically rebroadcasting an interview with the president from Fox News because they didn't like the interview. They didn't like the fact that the interview was happening or who was doing the interview and what was being said. And that's another one of my pet peeves is that, as I said earlier, a lot of times really awful things are said It's bad enough they're said once, but then they're rebroadcast, even by people who take a position against what's being said. So more people hearing the bad message. So in the name of criticizing another network and the president, they're doing exactly what that other network and that president would want, retelling their story, just as they would like to see happen. So there are shows about the media, literally media shows about the media, that are just as objectionable as the media itself. One thing I've noticed recently is how a false equality can be established between events that occur. False equivalence, I think, is the word I'm looking for, between events that occur. So, for example, our current president is pretty well known for being a COVID super spreader with events that have no way not to be a super spreader event all over the country and even in the White House. And a false equivalence has been made between that and the governor of California, who hosted a dinner for 10 people. And I can't tell you how many times I've now heard that story on Fox News. The governor of California hosted a dinner for 10 people after telling the citizens of California that they should not do such things. Yep, bad move, bad judgment, but in no way equivalent to being a super spreader, in no way equivalent to running dozens of rallies with thousands of people not wearing masks all over the country. No way equivalent to running those types of events in the Rose Garden of the White House in front of the entire country, setting a horrible example and making dozens of people sick. There's not an equivalence there. Yet, if you say the false thing enough times and loudly enough, you can make that false thing true. And that's another one of my beefs with the media, is that they make false things true by repeating it often enough. And even when that network might not be themselves saying the false thing, they're repeating and rebroadcasting the false thing that was said. And when people hear a false thing often enough, they will start to believe it. Sometimes they don't even need to hear it very many times to start to believe it. But by the time you've heard it dozens or hundreds of times, as we are currently experiencing with the false narrative that our elections are rigged, people believe it. And while we love to give our fellow citizens the credit that, well, they must have checked it out for themselves to really believe such a bad thing about our country. No, they didn't. They heard it from one source, the only source that might matter to them, the leader of our country. And that's all it took to make them believe something horrible about our election system. So the media plays a really big role in perpetuating those false narratives. They are complicit in that. And while some of them have claimed to not rebroadcast incorrect information, in my observation, they do it all the time. How's the media become so big, especially the news media? How did that happen? I think it's an outgrowth of some character traits that we ourselves have to take a look at. And I raise my hand to say I could be the first in line on that front. You know, we want to be informed, but we also have this attraction to gossip. And that's what the news has become. It's become gossip. It's become what used to be whispered in the hallways, but now it's blasted out all day long. And that's a failure on our part, because if we stopped watching these shows, they would go away. They are here, and in the numbers that they're here, and with the budgets that they have, because they have advertisers and because we watch them all the time. So we could be part of the solution if we don't like what's happening with the media. But I'd also like to see the return of those professional standards that were established. And maybe we'll never see that. Maybe this is a one-way street, and all we'll see is a downward decline of the integrity of the media. But that would certainly be helpful in my mind. And don't get me wrong, just like with every other profession, because there's so many more people in our country, there are thousands of journalists. And most of those journalists, I'm sure, have excellent credentials. And the journalist associations always do a great job of awarding each other. But boy, I have to admit, there's some journalists, especially some anchors on some of the networks that I see that, no, shouldn't be there. Back in the day, say Walter Cronkite's peers, those were people at the top of their profession who understood the professionalism standards of journalism. And there were only a few of them. And they spent their entire careers waiting for that opportunity. And they had journalistic integrity. And while they might periodically be told something to do they might not like to do by their network, they often won those fights and had that kind of stature. Now I'm not sure what the minimum bar is for an anchor who spends an hour or more a day broadcasting the news to Americans. There's not much comparison, I can tell you that. It's important to understand the role that media is playing, because some of us spend too many hours a day in front of it. We all want and need information, and especially in times like these, when we need to know, hey, what's really going on? And I think we've all got to spend more time figuring out sources of information that are trustworthy and reliable, and not influenced by some of the things that the major cable networks are influenced by. And maybe that can still be found on PBS, or local news, or maybe you'll find some such sources online with YouTube broadcasts and that type of thing. But I think America needs to break itself of the cable news habit. It's become a cesspool, and it's become something that is helping to tear us apart. Because the divisions that we have are being amplified by something. They are not caused by our personal experiences. I have many, many friends on both sides of the political aisle, and my personal experiences with them would never lead me to have the kind of divisions that I see and sometimes experience, even with those good friends, family members. I think that those divisions are being amplified by our leadership and by the media. Okay, that's a topic that we will continue to explore here on Constitution Time. And even though it might not be as directly related to the Constitution as one might want, it's certainly something that's guaranteed by the Constitution and will never go away, nor should it. But I do think it's up to us to influence it back away from where it's been influenced to be right now. Take care, Americans. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for joining us here on Constitution Time.